Introduce yourself.
Yeah. So my name's Trey Blalock. I've been doing internet security for almost 30 years now. I used to manage at one point the world's largest financial transaction hub. I used to do bank robbery forensics for online banking, and then later ended up doing forensics for the U.S. Department of Justice for high-profile cases that go to Supreme Court or various circuit courts. Donald Vance versus Donald Rumsfeld's a real famous case I did. I've worked in just about every area of security you can imagine, and I've worked in 30 different countries, everywhere from Tanzania to Russia and all over Europe. And Currently, I'm also the CISO of Coinstar, although the talk today has nothing to do with that. And then I've been doing a lot of different types of pen testing and a mixture of threat intelligence and all sorts of defense automation for a lot of very large companies as well as high tech startups. And in a nutshell, it's my background.
So Trey, I made you host. I'm sorry. That may kind of ruin the ability to let more people in, but that's the best I could do.
Okay. Well, at least I can get the slides up, I think.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So I guess every so often I'd recommend just kind of hover over the and see if you need to admit more people. But I disabled the whatchamacallit room, so people should be able to just join in now.
Okay. And this is a link to get a copy of these slides if anybody would like. It's pretty easy to just hit it with the QR code that goes straight to the exact same link. Okay, and with that, I'm probably just going to go ahead and dive into this. This is a huge subject, and just doing a talk in limited time, in some sense, doesn't really do it justice. But I'm going to go through this fairly quick. I do have some background material that I have to cover in various parts of this to just kind of bring the conversation up, but I think you'll find a lot of that's very interesting. The first thing is just background on threats. There's a lot of different types of threat actors out there. I mean, traditionally they get portrayed as like a kid wearing a hoodie in a basement somewhere, but it's actually way larger than that. We've got everything from internal threats, disgruntled customers, disgruntled ex-employees, people seeking financial gain or even stock manipulation, activist groups like Anonymous that we've seen in the news over the past decade. And then more recently, we're seeing a lot of these crypto ransomware attackers, and they also part of what is considered organized crime. And there's a little bit of blurriness between this organized crime and what's called advanced persistent threats. And I want to talk about that for a little bit. The first thing I'm going to show you is there's a spreadsheet that everybody can download if they'd like. And this is a Google Doc, and you can get it at apt.threattracking.com down at the bottom right. The first tab that I see that I've got pulled up here is China. I just want to point out at the bottom that this is just the first one on the left. If I were to go to the next one, you see Russia. But China has also got some of the biggest threat actors out there. And every line for this spreadsheet, and again, it's a much bigger one when you download it, but every line on here is actually a different threat group. And each one of these threat groups is targeting different types of targets. So some are targeting military organizations, some are targeting chemical plants, some are targeting intellectual property companies, and that could even include intellectual property attorneys. Some are targeting, power infrastructure. In case there's a war with another country, they want to be able to turn all the power plants off, or maybe they want to shut down all the airports, or maybe they want to, do different things that disable an organization or a different country. And the same thing, like there's ones that will also target financial groups. But one thing I need to make people aware of is that some of the size of these groups are probably much larger than you would think. This top one, which on the left says Comet Crew, is frequently referred to as AP number one, APT number one. But this is actually just a straight up division of the Chinese military, and it's the People's Liberation Army Unit 61398, which is you'll see in that left column. And this is not an unusual thing. As governments got into cyber, they started building capability for cyber warfare. And these groups are just literally, in a lot of cases, the names for that. Now, in the case of Russia, Russia's foray into this started a little bit differently because Russia had a lot of organized crime groups. And they basically, in certain cases, had the government pay the organized crime groups to say, hey, you're good at hacking. Maybe you could help us. We might give you a little protection. And so theirs is uniquely a little bit different. And it has a little bit more of a self funding attitude. And that's why we see a lot of the ransomware coming out of places like Russia, and to a lesser extent, North Korea. North Korea is also the next tab if we kept going across on this sheet. Um, Now, the spreadsheet that I gave you, which is this threat tracking one, this has got a lot more unofficial names, and it also has things that are unknown groups that we haven't really attributed to anybody. It's fine. I find that it's actually a very, very useful reference for a lot of reasons, and also that spreadsheet goes way to the right, and there's a lot of tactics and references to events that have occurred. A smaller but much more well-defined group is the one that the MITRE ATT&CK website has. So if you go to attack.mitre.org and you click on that top area that says groups, this will actually give you a set of the exact same type of information, but it doesn't have all the unknown ones. These are all very well defined. All the different countries around the world agree that these exist. It's very straightforward. And these are very useful. And this site also has a lot of additional information, and it gets updated fairly fast if there is a change in some of the tactics. And so I highly recommend checking this website out if you can. Um, but so those are basically, in a nutshell, the definitions of like who some of the APTs are, but I haven't really described what advanced persistent threats are. Some of you know, some people might be new to this, so I'm just going to cover it really quick. But the concept of advanced persistent threat is more about that persistence piece and getting into a network and then staying there and maintaining control. So even if somebody patches, reboots machines, or if they start clearing things out, I can still get a foothold into the network. And a lot of the ways people are doing that is they're getting into industrial control systems, they're getting into printers, they're getting into any number of devices that people are less likely to look at or monitor or deal with the security. And there's really good attack frameworks for attacking things like printers and industrial control systems. So when people can get their hooks into something and it might be a thermostat in the wall of a business, that's not on the radar of the security team to patch, and it does a good job of giving an attacker a backdoor into certain networks. Same thing with the printers. So again, this concept of persistence is a really big deal when we're talking about some of these threat actors. And again, if you think of it from a nation state perspective, as all these large governments go into saying, we've got to have, cyber control of the internet, they're wanting to get these little footholds into each other so that they can watch. Generally, a lot of these aren't doing harm per se. They're not the ones stealing credit cards. They're not the ones ransomwaring your network. But there's a lot of overlap because of some of the self-funding nature of be it North Korea or Russia. And so it gets a little bit blurry on, what all's happening with that. And again, there's a lot of other types of threat actors, and there's also people doing ransomware that don't fall into APTs and don't fall necessarily even into organized crime. And I'll talk about that in a minute. The next slide I just need to cover for just background is this concept of asymmetric warfare. To discuss this, I kind of have to explain what symmetric warfare was. And that basically is like, if you think of the warfare in the 1700s, where people might march an army, you would basically have two countries that had roughly the same number of soldiers. And so they'd have two armies of maybe 1,000 troops go fight each other. And they were very symmetrical in that they were almost always the same size. And this is also when you had the battles where people are lining up in rows and doing, things that just we would look at as crazy these days. But that's kind of where that definition comes from. Asymmetric warfare became kind of the terminology for more of the guerrilla warfare style. And it's where we started to see smaller groups of people that became powerful against larger armies. Taken to an extreme, when we talk about asymmetric warfare in a sense of cyber, you get this scenario where you have like one SQL injection or literally one line of code, which can go against 20 million lines of defensive code, and it wins. And it's like a massive disparity in the amount of work trying to prevent something and the amount of work that the attacker had to do to get in. Likewise, $100 computer versus $100 million of defenses. So if like you're the defense department or something, you're spending tons of money and 24-hour staff, yet this person with $100 computer in certain situations can get in. Similar one is economic denial, distributed denial service scripts. And there's a couple of different names for these, but basically I could write a script that just racks up massive amounts of cloud bills. So I just start wasting your resources. Cost me nothing, cost you a lot of money. So this concept of this high asymmetric ratio gets to be very important in security. In one other example of this, like in a real world, is the idea of somebody burning down a house with one match. Like, it cost me a penny to light that fire, and it just does a tremendous amount of damage. Likewise, there's the reverse of this. We do occasionally have asymmetric defenses. And a really good example of that is just simply cryptography. It doesn't cost me a lot to, AES 256 encrypt a file, and yet it's extremely expensive to break that. It takes a lot of time and a lot of resources to do that. So there are times where asymmetry can be a defensive advantage, but generally speaking, it's an attacker's advantage by far. Again, I just needed to kind of point that out as we dig a little further into this. The next subject is this economics of scale. And a really good example of economics at scale happened a few years ago with the Den cyber attack of 2016. And I like pointing this out. And it's well worth looking at the Wikipedia page and look at exactly what this person did. But basically, they scanned the entire internet for default passwords. So passwords that were very public. I think the person even got them out of the manuals for the thing when they ended up catching the person. Basically, it was all of the default passwords that had never been changed on baby monitors, residential gateways, IP cameras, printers, and a lot of other simple devices where thousands of them were attached to the internet. And literally just gathered access to log into all of them, and then logged into all of them, and then launched into this very, very simple attack against core DNS infrastructure that ended up taking a huge amount of the internet down. And yet, so the amount of effort that person went through to do this was trivial, very simple. You could write a script to do this kind of thing, but the amount of damage done was massive. Another example of this, and I'll talk about how this is done a little bit later, is scanning all the IP4 addresses for a specific attack. One of the ones that happened a few years ago was where somebody just literally went across and deleted all the MongoDB databases they could find on the internet. They just said, yep, we're just going to delete all these. We've also seen similar ones for Hadoop. And there's a variety of different attacks that scan across the entire internet all day long, looking for places that they can connect. One of the points here that I'm going to mention and I'll talk about later is that, when the victims got hit, it literally was that first packet coming in that started to do this, and it took the Mongo database and told the Mongo database to delete itself. And so there was no reconnaissance step. There was nothing where the person could have seen this coming and prevented it. It was literally just this one, set of packets that went around the entire internet and just said, I'm going to delete all these databases. And this, for a lot of research projects, destroyed years of data, destroyed businesses. It was fairly damaging. And a simpler one that is easy to understand is also the distributed denial of service attacks. The way that these are frequently created costs nothing to the attacker. I mean, it's other than just a little bit of time, but they're kind of doing the same thing. It's like, let's scan the internet for resources that I can use to basically write a script to go connect all these devices and then have all these devices talk to something that's a target. And then what we're seeing with that is the scale of these is just getting tremendous. And this is an article from Google's blog from last month that actually shows kind of what the trending scale is on this. And it's something that I always point out to people is these curves, the second derivative is positive, which basically is like it's increasing and getting worse and worse and worse. This graph is also nice because it shows it in a mixture of bits per second, packets per second, which in that case, I'm sorry, that's packets per second, and then requests per second, which in the request per second case is just HTTPS requests. So it's a couple of different ways to look at that. But again, this is stuff that, a 15-year-old kid can do for free and just bring a financial network or something like that to its knees for a while. Doesn't cost a lot. Getting into the next step of these things, this is a great tool. It's a set of tools from zmap.io. Their DNS tool is also a really wonderful tool. But this is a set of tools, and I've highlighted on this screen that if you basically have a fairly beefy box on a very big internet connection, you can connect to all the IP4 addresses for the entire planet and get responses in 5 minutes. And previously, like I would say 10, 15 years ago, people would not believe this was even possible. But if you start looking at people that are watching these types of internet-wide scans, it's like, yeah, we see this all day long. I mean, this is very, very common. And this is a free tool that you can download and do this kind of thing with. Now, not everybody has that kind of connection. Not everybody has that kind of box. This will be the equivalent of a 4X box on AWS. So, I mean, people can get access to this, and attackers could take over a corporate box and use that to do this. But if you don't have a really big box or a giant internet connection, you can run it slower. And so maybe it takes you 2 hours or 24 hours. It's, you're still connecting to the entire internet. And if you can do that in any reasonable amount of time, you can get a lot of information quickly. Now, you'll see that on the screen I show Zmap. Zgrab is grabbing, different pieces of data from different ones. And you can also get data collections of certificates, DNS, all sorts of strings for responses, telnet grabs. There's a lot of stuff you can do with this. There's also other tools that do this, like MassScan. Same type thing, slightly different interface, different commands for usage. Very powerful tool, and this also advertises itself as scanning the entire IP4 internet in under 6 minutes. So it's extremely fast. Another older method of getting this kind of data is where groups like Shodan, which traditionally did this with Nmap, they basically scan the entire internet and put it into a database, and then you can go into the database and search. So in this page, I went in, typed MongoDB. This is pretty old, but what I basically did was said, where are all the MongoDB databases that I can connect to online right now? And it gives me a list of these. Again, this is an older method of doing this, and it's a fairly manual method, but it's also very useful if you've never done this. So it's worth going to Shodan.io, checking it out if you've never seen it. And you can type anything in there. You can type password fields, look for a specific Cisco device, whatever you want. So it's a lot of fun to play with if you've never seen it. Now, a more advanced way to do this, and this is closer to what some of the APTs do, is they basically build their own database. So Census is a database, and census.io will take you to this. And they basically have been scanning the entire internet every day for 9 years. And so I can look back and say, 8 years and 3 days ago, what did the internet look like? And it can basically show me almost all the open ports, depending on how old of the scan it is. But it will show me all the SSL certs. I can download all the SSL certs. I can see all the websites, all the telnet ports, all the secure shell ports. I can get a really good idea of what a system looked like a long time ago. People are also taking this data and they're looking at it at points in time, and you can determine how fast the company patches things. Do they just patch on Patch Tuesday? Do they just patch at the first of the month? Maybe they only patch quarterly. You can look at that from looking at the deltas of the server versions over time. So a database like this is really, really powerful for somebody to grab that and look at it. And again, a lot of these resources are free, and APTs, you can build one of these databases yourself just by using Zmap. So one of the reasons that I'm bringing this up is that APTs are doing this thing, and I talked about this on the slide that looked like this. APTs, and the reason there's so many of them is each one of these APTs is targeting a particular sector. So they're targeting just finance, or they're targeting just military bases, or they're targeting just telecom, or they're targeting just cloud computing companies or banking, whatever it is. And the reason they're doing that is it's easier for them to understand, like as one group of people working together, what all the ins and outs and parts and all the vendors and the third-party connections are, which it's much harder to do that for the whole internet as whole, because all these different industries look different. But if you've got a group of people that are saying, like, we're just going to attack all the different fintech companies, it makes your job a lot easier to find these. And again, they can focus on what these targets look like. They'll even attend the same kind of conferences. They'll learn everything they can about the industry that they're attacking. And it makes them very effective. It also makes doing things like writing phishing emails and stuff a million times easier. You tend to learn what the dates are for certain events in a group. It's very, very useful. And also, it's again, they all share the same supply chains, so they have some of the same attack vectors. So a lot of banks, they don't do their own check scanning. They'll all outsource that to a third party. You can go through their front end web pages and see the little cookie that'll say like, yes, this is linked to such and such check scanning company. So you can kind of map out these businesses pretty easily. Now, all the stuff that I've mentioned so far, it may sound like a lot of data. It may sound like it's really, really big, but all of that stuff for like a whole snapshot of the internet easily fits in less than a terabyte. It's not as much data as you can think of, and I've definitely had that entire data set. In fact, I think in my pocket I've got like the entire internet's DNS on a USB key. And that thing is like 35 megs. It's not big at all. So you can get this kind of data, and you can also get this kind of data for the IP6 internet too, which is another useful thing. In fact, getting the quad A DNS records gives you all the public IP6 addresses really quick. So that's a neat way if you want to start mapping into IP6. But again, these attacks have changed things where traditionally we used to could watch with an IDS and look at our firewall, and we would see somebody might do an nmap scan, or they might start looking at an API, and we could kind of watch it and maybe block their IP address. And so a long time ago, the first contact we ever got from an attacker was reconnaissance, and we would see that and we might do something. Now it's straight up. First packet is a punch in the face. It is a full-blown working SQL injection attack or a NoSQL injection attack, pulling tables. And that's the first set of TCP packets coming in. It's just like, you didn't even see it coming at all. And part of the reason it's like that is because of these tools like ZMAP that allow people to take a smaller attack and then weaponize it and then run it across the entire IP4 internet. When it comes to your IP address, maybe it's been running for an hour, but you didn't see any of it. And the first connection that it comes to you is a working attack. And again, these happen all the time, but they may be for attacks that don't affect any of your machines, so it may not have any impact on your network. But it is something that does go on the internet a lot. The other important thing here is there is literally no time for humans to respond. I mean, there's just no way. It's too fast. The attack is completed its entire cycle of getting in and starting to pull data in like 25 to 250 milliseconds. There's no way you're even going to get that written to a log before it's already going over. And as I mentioned, weaponized bots, they do scan the internet IP4 address all the time. So one thing that I just wanted you to take away is that there's a big gap between traditional security defenses and, more importantly, traditional security practices and their effectiveness against these automated offenses. And that gap is getting huge really quick. And in a sense, the attackers are definitely winning. So, and again, I'm still kind of covering a little bit of background information, but we're working towards something where I'm going to bring it all together. The next thing is changes in threats. So as these threat actors start to try to increase their businesses. So let's say, you and 5 friends decide we're going to start ransomwaring companies, and eventually it's like, well, we can only do 6 a day or whatever it is. They are trying to scale their businesses up so that they can make more money, because making like 20 million a day or whatever on ransomware isn't enough. So they're going to go for everything. So cybercrime as a service is this thing that we're starting to see pop up. And it's places where people can basically say, like, I can help ransomware my company's network if I get 25 or 50% cut in Bitcoin. And they basically did all the software work. They provide help desks. They get the malware installed. They can provide training for how to deploy things. They deal with payment processing. They can deal with payment anonymization by taking the Bitcoin that came from the ransomware, effectively washing it, mixing it through a couple other currencies and different packaging mechanisms, and then paying you. And they also have malware marketplaces where people are going to buy these types of tools for a variety of different reasons, not necessarily just malware. They also have analysts that provide professional advice for how much they can ransom from companies. And effectively what they're doing is they're business analysts. They can say, well, this company's publicly traded. We can look at their S1. We can see this is how much money they have in the bank. You should ask for X. So this business is scaling up in a pretty crazy way. And unfortunately, right now, with all the people out of work due to COVID and stuff, you've got a lot of people more desperate for money. It's definitely increasing the ransomware as a whole. Ransomware as a service is explicitly the kind of service that I was just talking about. These are popping up because of the amount of money involved and the very low bar to entry. This is becoming a very popular one as far as a type of crime as a service. And again, we're seeing huge amounts of money getting flown into ransomware. There's also other things with ransomware that people need to pay attention to. One thing that I always point out to people is that they're merging into other pieces of space. These two variants of ransomware that recently started going into industrial controls. And industrial control systems or SCADA systems are a very different type of computing resource that's much harder to protect. They're very vulnerable, but they're very rarely attacked. In these particular cases, they had, I think it was 64 different mechanisms for shutting the industrial control system off. But they could have done things like tamper it, like turn up the amount of fuel you're pumping and turn on the fire or something like that. They could have been very lethal. These were just starting to probe into that area, but we're finding this built into parts of ransomware, which is kind of scary in a way. The other thing that we're seeing that these APTs are doing is they're getting much better at monetizing the ransomware or whichever way that they're kind of extorting a company. And one of the things that they've started doing in the past year is stealing sensitive data and then also looking for keys and passwords into supply chain companies so that they can go from one company to the next if possible and then ransomware the next company. But the biggest thing is to steal sensitive data. And this can be regulated data. It could be things like credit cards, healthcare records, any number of things. And what they do is they say, okay, I'm going to try to ransom you for $50 million. And if you say, well, we've got great backups, we're not worried about it, sorry, we're going to restore. Then they say, okay, well, if you don't pay us the 50 million, we're going to release all these records. And this creates a really nasty situation. And there's a lot of ethical issues around this stuff. It's pretty long conversation about that, but this is one of the things we're starting to see is this blended extortion for ransomware and extorting individuals. We're also seeing some other nasty things where people are trying to extort uh, pictures of people in their house that are naked or fake nudes. There's a lot of different things, but that blended extortion of if you don't pay me for this, I'm going to release this is starting to be a more common thing. Ultimately, ransomware trends, there are so many targets that are vulnerable on the internet that these organized crime groups literally just don't have the time to take advantage of them all. And one of the things that they're also doing right now is trying to hire pen testers to leverage and basically scale their business. So ransomware is going to continue to grow very fast. Ransomware as a service is a horrible model for defending networks. And it's something that we have to watch out for. So those are big changes and threats, especially for the last 2 years. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about attack surface and why some security stuff is failing. One thing about attack surface is we traditionally think of attack surface as everything that's going to our network. We think of it as our websites, any open ports, DNS servers, FTP, email, those types of things, as well as you've got attack surface that would be onto a particular computer or within a certain API. There, traditionally we used to think of network security in the sense of protecting a network. And there was always a cat and mouse game of like new hole came out, let's fix it, let's put some other kind of vulnerability, multiple layers of defense to protect it so when the next hole comes out they still can't get to our data. And there was this kind of back and forth on that had been going on for years. One second, I just saw something. And then when we got to cloud services, um, the problems with cloud services basically made our attack surfaces move a lot. And that was when we started seeing things like lots of S3 buckets that were getting opened by, maybe it was a third party or an analytics firm that a company hired, but we were seeing data just get strewn all over the internet for like the last 3 years. It seems to be a little bit better now, but like when people were migrating to the cloud, they made a lot of mistakes and lost a lot of data. And part of it was because that attack surface had moved, and the people that they'd hired to do this previous type of defense didn't know how to do it when it was on the cloud. They made a lot of beginner mistakes, and it became kind of a problem. Um, then what we're seeing now is this is the attack surface is changing even more rapidly. Part of this has also been unique to this year because of COVID-19. And because of COVID-19, we've got all these people working from home, and a lot of people are connecting to the internet differently. But we're seeing the attackers have realized they're like, we can take advantage of these people that are at their house. Um, and when we take advantage of these people at their house, the way we're going to target them is very different. We're going to do spear phishing to their personal account. We're going to go through their LinkedIn account. We're going to connect to them. We're going to maybe create like a fake employee at the same company and connect to them via LinkedIn. And then maybe we start sending them, say, hey, I need to send you some email, but that email has actually got emotet and it's going to launch ransomware into a company or whatnot. Facebook messages, same thing, a variety of social media attacks. And then we're also seeing people get attacks on their cell phones, be it cell phone based apps. We're also seeing attacks coming through malicious links via SMS. Those are also an easy one to spread wide scale. And we're even seeing attacks in video games. So the attack surface in very much sense has changed from our traditional corporate network to attacking the individuals that work for our company. And because of things like LinkedIn and a variety of social media services, it's really easy to find who works for a certain company. And this attacking the individuals has gotten crazy. It's even going to the point of dating sites and stuff. It's very personal, and it's coming across all channels that people have. The other thing about attack surface in that sense is in traditional networks, we may have had proxies and VPNs and firewalls and WAFs. We had a lot of different things with internal firewalls and stuff that were protecting users, or maybe you had a call center that this one call center wasn't as trusted as maybe the executives or the IT staff. Um, we had that all built into the way our buildings were designed. When everybody went home to work, a lot of companies weren't prepared to segregate their VPNs and give people access to, just what the minimalist thing that they needed. And a lot of people got access to stuff they weren't supposed to get access to server wise. A lot of people still have more access from those changes. But the people that are sitting at home are behind these just horribly insecure devices. And it's causing a real problem because a lot of people are realizing they can get default passwords for these devices fairly easy. And some can be attacked with old CVEs to get root exploits. And a lot of these are just Linux boxes. But they haven't been patched in years in some cases. And so they're ripe for exploitation. And so people can do things like they can figure out, from an email you send or something like that, what your GeoIP location is, or what your IP address of your router is, more, importantly, from getting you to surf to a website or something. And then they can literally start attacking this device and get to your home network. And from a company standpoint, the company can't see a thing. And likewise, if they want to exfiltrate data out, the company cannot see it. Whereas if you were in the office, they could have. All this is to say, and again, there's a very much a larger conversation here, but that technology itself has become the battlefield. And so as new services and communications are coming out, those are going to be where we're going to get attacked next. So it's the next social media application, it's the next file sharing application, it's the next app on your phone. Those are the ways we're about to get attacked. And as soon as these things start getting popular, the attacks are going across these channels towards our user base. So it's definitely something that's fast moving, and it's something that a lot of companies aren't paying attention to, and in certain cases can't pay attention to. It's, like your corporate, security team is not going to be accessing your dating site, for example. That's, definitely a privacy violation. So the battle, in a sense, is moving beyond the traditional domain of control. We are moving away from defending a network to defending all these people and individuals. And that is a very different type of war. And the traditional defenses we used to use don't work in this war. And I reference it. It's kind of like going from bows and arrows to machine guns suddenly showing up. It's a fairly big difference, it's also equally as easy to attack. Because you're basically attacking people that have no defenses in some sense. It's quite a different scenario than it used to be. And this is not to say that our traditional defenses aren't useful; they still are, but it just typically isn't where the battle is at. If I can get somebody on their personal email to open up a document and that ransomware is, and it just happens to be on their corporate laptop and kicks something off, I win. And all of the millions of dollars a company spent defending their network doesn't make a bit of difference in there. So one of the things you've got to realize is how fast can you adapt, and that's where security economics comes in. Now, in this example, I'm going to go through real quick. I'm just talking about a typical threat actor out on the internet trying to attack a web server, which is the blue dot on the screen that has a database behind it. What all these green dots are is, as the threat actor sends a packet, these are all the different potential security controls we could put in front of a web server. There's some that are between the web server and the database. Those are a little bit more rare, but we can still do it. And then to the right of that is where logging from an attacked database and an attacked web server would go. They go into your syslog. That might feed into a SIM if it's not also a SIM. Then you've got processing of your SIM rules to say, hey, I found something. Maybe we alert a human. Maybe that triggers an incident response process. And then eventually maybe we have to do forensics and postmortem. So in a sense, this is the flow of an attack. And I just use this as an example because it's really easy to explain. But this is one example of an external attack flow. There are thousands of these. If I'm attacking you through SMS messaging, it looks totally different. If I'm going to attack you through Facebook or LinkedIn, those are going to look different as well. But the principle of it is the same. There's different places we can put security controls, and they kind of have a flow to it in the sense of time. The one thing I need to point out also is from the red dot from the attacker sending a packet all the way to the database, we're talking milliseconds. And then immediately it goes from seconds to minutes to hours to days to weeks even, and in some cases months, because sometimes this takes a while. So just keep in mind that this is conversational. There's a lot of different ways this gets applied. And we would think that all of our security spending, or at least most of it, should be in front of the thing we're trying to protect. We want to prevent these attacks from getting in. It turns out that like 80% of corporate spending is after the attack. It's in these SIMs and these logging systems and dealing with all the processing of that and getting it to a human and incident response. And the human labor costs around that are huge, and incident response costs are big. Forensics is large. If it has to get litigation on top of it, you're spending huge amounts of money. But it's kind of an unusual thing because all of our human focus is over here on the right. And that kind of is what's keeping us stuck in this side of reacting. But we would be much better off if we were pushing the security more towards the front. Then this is the slide I just skipped, but basically this time analogy of doing prevention versus response, it applies across all these different security domains. So it can also be testing before we deploy as opposed to testing after deployment, really good security architecture up front versus security as an afterthought and trying to bolt something on. This sense of time and when you intercept and put security in is a huge factor on how much protection you get in the long run. And again, just like kind of like Aikido, we want to move ourselves towards the attacker, and everything we can do that's moving us closer to that attacker and putting more of an insertion point between the attacker and the things we'd like to protect, the better off we are. The other thing, and as I mentioned earlier, is a lot of these attacks are being automated. And part of that had to do with scaling, because if I want to go attack 4 billion IP addresses, I can't do that manually. I've got to run this as a script. I've got to do this in an automated fashion. But because those things are automated, they happen to be very fast. And so one thing that ends up happening is like something gets a foothold, kicks out a reverse shell. Literally a second or two later, we see something coming in and trying to use that shell. So the time that you have from the first point of entry to being able to stop it or being able to prevent it from spreading further into your network is extremely small. And it's to the point where there's no point in having a human try to respond in some sense because we're almost like glacier speed. We're so slow compared to the computers. And so it's really, really important that we start doing our defenses in a more automated fashion. And again, humans are way too slow, and our defensive processes should not be based around them. The larger, more advanced attackers are rarely human at this point. And what I mean by that is we're rarely seeing manual attacks as the first point of attack. We may see something where they're, expanding or gathering more information internally, but those initial attacks are almost always automated and they're super fast. And we need to have our defenses as equally automated. One thing that was interesting is traditional security models assume the security operations center, and that actually came from like the first space missions, that we thought we had to have a knock and we had to have this like alerting area for the humans. And that was just the way people thought it was done. But that also ends up creating a situation where we're making all of our decisions in the after the fact sense. Um, and again, one of the things I keep seeing is security budgets are very misbalanced. I would say that you certainly you've got to keep the back end stuff. You've got to have your SIM, your forensics and stuff. You've got to keep that. I'm not saying get rid of that at all, but you should have a more balanced security budget for prevention. And that's the thing that I don't see a lot of companies do. I don't see a lot of companies putting a lot of money in the front. It's like almost traditionally everything gets, put on how are we going to respond to this rather than how are we going to prevent it. Um, again, as I've said several times now, we've got to start automating more of our defenses. Economics, it's much, much cheaper to block up front than to do forensics and everything else afterwards. And then again, keep in mind that whole set of slides just then was about one particular type of attack flow. We have to kind of consider this around all attack flows that are coming towards the people we're trying to protect. And as time goes on, we're going to have a lot weirder sets of attack surfaces. We're going to have more third-party people in our companies involved, more software as a service involved. But we've also got to start defending these individuals, and this creates some really interesting problems because we end up having privacy boundary issues because we can't put like full packet monitoring on somebody else's home network. That's really invasive. There's a lot of things that we could do that would offer them more protection, but they come with trade-offs that aren't necessarily the best thing, for the human in a sense of privacy. So one thing that we would be wise to get better at is learning how to protect our employees and having them protect themselves. And we almost need a sense of either having dedicated devices for work, for like mobile devices. It's a really good thing if a company can afford that. Not very many do. But it's really nice just because we can separate the employees apps or bad phone behavior from the work phone behavior. Same thing with laptops. But we're at this point where we almost need to start providing threat intelligence to the users so that they know, like, these are what these LinkedIn attacks look like. These are what the certain emotech coming into a Word document looks like. And make the attack, make the humans much stronger in this. The important thing about this in a lot of ways, unfortunately, not all companies are evolving unless something really bad happens. This is, continuing story of security is if you don't change your own world, the world's going to change you, and it's going to happen whether you like it or not. And my recommendation is to get in there as quick as you can and start learning about defense automation. The other thing that I would also say is that defense automation can be really simple. It can be single one-line scripts. It can be any number of things. A lot of people, when they start thinking of automation, they're like, oh, I'm not like a crazy programmer. I don't know how to do this stuff. Honestly, a lot of the stuff that needs to be automated is just dead simple, little like 1-2 line scripts. They're not anything outrageous. I have some closing recommendations. I know we're kind of at the end of time here, but I'm not in a rush. I can keep taking questions. But things that I've noticed that a lot of people and a lot of companies aren't doing is paying attention to what their biggest threats and their biggest security challenges are. A lot of people don't even, like, if I ask them what they are, they can't even identify them because they haven't really thought about it. And then understanding how to find what's not on your radar. Like, one thing that you can do in a sense is say, like, what are all the things that my employees or my company are interacting with, and of all these different things, are there any of them that we haven't addressed the security of? Have we addressed the security of our outsourced services? Or is there a problem with like Jira security, or is there a problem with some third party? Are we backing up Google Docs or Office 365, or we just that's the only copy that exists? So there's a lot of things where if you start working through really good questions, you'll start having some of these problems surface, and you can start taking advantage of that really quick. So it's a big thing that I recommend, is to kind of think about how your process of analyzing security across the company is. Um, Creating a formal process to keep up with changes, I think that's a really important piece. A lot of people just kind of go through life and it's just like, I'm going to attend this seminar, I'm going to do this, but they don't actually have a formal plan for like, what are the next 5 things I want to learn? What are these other technologies? And are there things that I need to read on a daily basis? How am I getting threat intelligence information? How do I know what the new attacks are? A lot of people don't have a system for that. And I think if you have a system for that, it'll actually make you a lot more effective. If you happen to have Active Directory, just because ransomware is rampant, one super important thing to know: patching will do almost nothing to protect you. And that sounds counterintuitive, but if you actually do an audit of the security configuration, especially if you have an older company, you will find all sorts of problems, thousands of problems, and patching doesn't fix those. And so you need to understand that there's a big difference between fixing your security configurations and just keeping something patched. And when it comes to ransomware taking over your network or taking over an entire Active Directory domain, that is a big deal. Finally, I definitely recommend everybody start learning more about the MITRE ATT&CK framework. If you really understand it, it can actually save you time, but a lot of people get a little lost in the complexity of it. I can talk about that at some point. It's a much bigger topic, but it's a very, very useful one. And then again, always think about the long-term effects of your security solutions. Try to avoid security solutions that create a ton of labor. You want things that are automated, that make your life easy in the long run. And then finally, always think about the economics of your decisions. Last little bit, here's a couple of tools. For Active Directory, you can download a free demo of this software to just quickly assess your Active Directory. It's from pingcastle.com. It's not a free tool, it's just a free demo, but if you've never run something like this in your environment, you definitely want to. Bloodhound is a great tool, but it's a little bit more complex to use. Ping Castle is a lot easier to get started with. But this is also really, really useful for finding permission problems, and it can can even help you with hardening Active Directory. One other reference that I think is useful, and again, this is partially, I'm just trying to help people deal with all the ransomware stuff going on, is there's a really good Active Directory security assessment checklist from the French CERT. And that link is here at the bottom of the page. And again, you can get all the slides from this link that I'll have at the end. And then one other bit is if you end up where you have to pay ransom for whatever reason, you didn't have offsite backups, or the most common thing I see is your backups are on the same domain that got hacked. And because your backup servers were in that domain, they got ransomware too. That's like, I think 90% of the places I see pay out. That's the reason why. But if you have to do it, one thing that's useful is they'll send you a Bitcoin wallet or a Bitcoin wallet that you would send the money to. You can type that into a site like this. This is blockchair.com, and you can look at the previous payments. And when you see previous payments, not always, but sometimes you'll see a pattern. You might see that, like, okay, they seem to take $10 million for every payment. They're asking us for 18, but the last ones have been, varying numbers. Let's see if we can ask to lower the ransom down to 10 million. So knowing that you can go look at this stuff and see how much money has been transferred is a very useful tip. And that's it. I just wanted to kind of go over those. Again, here's the slides. And if anybody has any questions, please let me know. And I don't know if I need to do anything else with Zoom here.
No, you know what? It's like, I think we'll leave you in control. Hopefully everybody can hear me.
Okay.
It's like you'll be able to, you'll just end the session. It's like, I think when you log out, I think the entire thing will shut down, which is good enough for me as far as I'm concerned. Trey, I thank you very much for a great presentation. Again, I apologize. This was like, I would say my fault 100%. I will not try to pass this off to anybody else. Scheduling has always been kind of an interesting process when you just try to get everybody organized. And it's been such a pain thanks to COVID. I'm not going to take 100% of the blame. I will blame the virus to some level. To the rest of the board members, thank you very much for reaching out to me and making sure that we still managed to pull this off. Hopefully we didn't lose too many people in that first 10 minutes of my absence. So if there are any questions, I think that'd be a great time. I saw that there's a handful of things that were actually discussed in the conversation. So I'm going to try to pull some of these up to see if anybody had any questions, Trey, before we lose you, and maybe we can answer them. So there's just a lot of general agreement that about what you've been talking about. Red Purple team, your own platform. So that was one comment coming from Joe membership.
Yeah, definitely.
And I mentioned privileged access workstations. Now, I have a lot of history and understanding that space, but I refer to a Stanford doc on it, not the Microsoft one.
Yeah, Frank.
Which I published.
You should talk about that saws and pause, what the intention is. The intent.
This is
conceptually, it's hard. That's true.
This is Trey's show. I will gladly do a session on privileged access and zero trust sometime in the future. But Trey probably has some insight on it too.
True.
Yeah. And again, I talked about a lot of really huge subjects, and it's really hard to kind of deal with all the little bitty issues. And there's tons of other things that I could add into this. So.
We've only been doing this for 30 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
But does anybody else have any questions? So
the session is recorded, and I will say this on record. So